conversation today. I am joined by two panelists, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. So I would love to for you to tell everyone who you are, where you are, and how you got there, I suppose, in the widest opening. And I'm going to start with Sian.
Hi everyone, so I work at Wheal Martyn Clayworks in St Austell, Cornwall. This whole year I've been doing a trainee curator internship, and it's been really interesting, obviously, because most of it has been during various lockdowns and what have you. And I finished that in November and then went straight to engagement officer role in Wheal Martyn. So yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind for me.
Thank you. And Michael.
Thanks, Louise. Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Norman, and I'm currently data specialist for the British Film Institute for the video digitisation strand of the Heritage 2022 project. Quite a mouthful. Previous to this, I undertook the National Archives Bridging the Digital Gap traineeship, another mouthful, between October 2018 and December 2019. The Heritage Lottery funded scheme aimed to bring 8 trainees with technical skills into the archive sector from a diverse range of backgrounds. And for the duration of my traineeship, I was seconded at the East Anglian Film Archive in Norwich.
Thank you very much. I will also say that our Fair Museum Jobs Zoom person, Tom, may also be called on during this session, as he did a traineeship a few years ago. So we might come to Tom for some other perspectives throughout this session as well. So you may hear his cheerful tone as noted in the chat again. So I'm going to come straight in to the first question. How did you find your traineeship? What was the process of getting a place, and what were you doing before you got on your traineeship? I will start with Michael this time.
Okay, I discovered it through luck, really. At the time, I think it was August 2018, I was working in retail and I'd done several customer service positions in banking for over a decade and was actively looking for a change, really. As it happened, an old friend, let's call him Colin, because that's his name, was in Norwich at the time, finishing up on a similar National Archives traineeship called Archives Unlocked. And we had a few informal chats where he showed how much he was enjoying it, and he taught me through the projects he'd been doing. He was installing and testing open source preservation systems, etc. And that gave me an introduction to what the function of the archive was, and my first encounters with things like metadata and digital preservation. Colin steered me towards a link on his Facebook timeline for a new traineeship called Bridging the Digital Gap, which was the heir apparent to his course. The TNA were looking to recruit 8 trainees who could be seconded to host archives in London and in the east and north of England. If I remember correctly, I only had 48 hours until the application deadline, so I scrambled something together to the archive which seemed best suited to me, which was the East Anglian Film Archive, as I had a film degree from 10 years previously, and Colin had raved about life in Norwich, so it seemed the perfect match. The recruitment process itself was fairly straightforward and standard, I think. There was a competency-based online application through civil service jobs. And from there, I was invited down to Norwich for an interview with managers from the archive and from the National Archives, which included a practical exercise I was prepared for. And within a couple of weeks, I packed up our things and moved from rainy Ayrshire to sunny East Anglia.
Thank you. I'm going to come back with a couple of questions about what is competency-based interviewing like, but I will come to Sian first to just get an insight into how you found your traineeship and the process and what you were doing before.
So I had actually heard of this traineeship. So it's been on a kind of running basis for 2 years. I think I'm the second year, and I think they're going to do it again next year. So I had interviewed for it the year before, so I kind of vaguely knew that it would be coming up at the same time of year. And I was doing bits and bobs, volunteering in Royal Cornwall Museum and other museums around Cornwall. And then I kind of just jumped out of museums for a while, and then was a conservation assistant in a National Trust property for a while. And kind of, yeah, just sort of stopped thinking about museums, really, sadly, because I kind of felt a bit like, oh, no, nothing's coming up. I've been working retail for years alongside studying and volunteering and stuff as well. So when I went for the traineeship this year, they already remembered me from last year, and they'd already quite liked me from last year. So that was already in my favour. And I'm hoping maybe the National Trust bit added to my CV. I'm not sure. But the traineeship itself was trainee curator, and it was quite a collaborative project. I think primarily created by Cornwall Museum's partnership with various funding from different funders. And it was using 4 Cornish museums, and then there were 5 trainees. So one of the museums was quite cheeky. They managed to get 2 trainees, not mine, unfortunately. Well, no, actually, maybe good for me. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really, yeah, I've really enjoyed the whole process of it. But I think that I got it maybe because I'd already gone for it the year before and they recognised me. But I don't remember seeing it advertised too many places, actually. I kind of went for it because I had a vague idea it was coming up again. But I don't have any distinct memories of seeing it advertised in too many places.
Thanks. And Michael, I'm just going to come back to you to talk a bit about that
Sure.
interview process you mentioned, because not every job is kind of a competency-based interview. So what kind of things came up in that people might want to prepare for if they're thinking of applying for similar?
I can't remember what the exact competencies were, but it's your fairly standard. Are you a team player? Do you work well in team groups? Things like that. And I think what they were looking for was examples you could give rather than just your opinion on things. Could you give a hard and fast, here's where I did this and this was the end I achieved from it? Pardon that my mind is blank as to what the questions were, but I think every job description will have what the competencies are, and it'll be written plain in there, and probably under the essential criteria or something like that.
Thanks. So I just kind of want to reflect to everyone who is here listening that really applying for a traineeship is kind of the same as applying for a job. It's a similar thing that you're going to have to do most of the time. You're likely to be writing an application, although some traineeships allow alternatives, maybe a video sometimes. A colleague of mine mentioned one where she was able to apply with a collage instead of a written application, which I think is quite interesting. So it is worth keeping an eye out on what the application requirements actually are. I'm going to come on to my next question, which I think is potentially quite expansive. What was your experience of doing a traineeship? So what were your kind of major projects? How were you supported? What opportunities did you have from doing that traineeship? I'm going to come to Sian on that one first.
So obviously I can only talk for my own experience, but my experience has been really good. So like I said, it was created by Cornwall Museum's partnership, and the one thing I found is that there has been a sense of collaboration and not competition fostered. So me and the other trainee curators in the other Cornish museums, we all became really quite close friends because we had these very regular peer network meetings. And I think that those were really helpful because already you feel like you've got a small little community of people in the exact same boat as you, with the exact same point in their career, and they can understand things. So I think that element of being collaborative and not competitive was really great in my traineeship, particularly. And again, speaking from personal experience, my team at Wheal Martyn were fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Straight away, they kind of treated me like, well, any other normal member of staff. I wasn't treated as somehow like lesser than the other members of staff. And it was, I've noticed that someone in the chat has said, are internships and traineeships the same thing? So technically, it was a bit of confusion. Yeah, I don't think they are. There was a bit of confusion with mine because it was called a curatorial internship, but then also a trainee curator. Well, so it was a bit like what's going on, but it was a traineeship. And yeah, so my experience was really good. I got to, and I don't know if COVID has had any kind of influence on some of the things I've had to do this year, whether or not I've been busier than I perhaps would have been. But I've had some really great experience, curating my own temporary exhibition, overseeing projects like updating the guidebook, updating the signs around the site, doing loads of social media stuff, and again making loads of like little videos and things like that. And I don't know if that's because this year itself called for a lot more digital content. Yeah, I was really welcomed by the team. I never felt like I was, you know, sort of a rung lower than them. They were really, really nice. They really welcomed me, made me feel like, well, just any other member of staff. So my personal kind of experience of a traineeship's been really good. And because obviously it's led me on to being engagement officer at the same post museum, I feel like it has been really beneficial to me personally. And I would kind of, yeah, I would like to see more traineeships, possibly kind of phasing out more volunteer roles, but maybe that's another question.
Oh yeah, I think we're going to come on to that. I'm just going to pick up on our internships and traineeships, the same thing. At fair museum jobs, we would say no. And we would normally expect a traineeship to have some kind of potentially a qualification attached to it. So we did a session earlier this week with the Museum Galleries Scotland Skills for Success trainees, and they all gained an SVQ, a work-based learning qualification. Sian and Michael, by nodding or head shaking, did you have qualifications attached to your traineeships? No, so it's not across the board. That's the difficulty. Like normally that's what you might expect from a traineeship, but it's not all the time. Internships are usually shorter if you're using them in the kind of standard way that internship is used. I think that Sian's is more complicated. The naming is not typical. I wonder, Tom, if you might want to weigh in on the internship, traineeship verbiage.
Yeah, sure. So I think the term internship is not terribly helpful because nobody's entirely sure what it means, and it's often used to disguise the fact that a position is unpaid when it really should be paid. I think it would be helpful to just do away with the term internship really altogether and just replace it with trainee. I did a traineeship and it did have the qualification attached, so there is definitely some diversity, I think, about what traineeships mean across the board. However, I would say the qualification was the least enjoyable aspect of my traineeship.
Oh, I might pick you up on that in a few moments. I'm going to come back to Michael. What was kind of your experience of doing the traineeship? What did you get involved in? Did you have a kind of network of people similarly to Sian?
Yes, I did. I'll start by talking through it, I think. Trying to think of some verbs. Great fun, hard work, varied, at times really challenging, but generally, I would say a rewarding process. The whole gamut. My 13 months was split between two things, really. The scholarly aspects, which was undertaking a bespoke online course through Moodle set by the TNA, which covered many of the topics that they say the digital archivist needs to understand. Digital acquisition, digital preservation, digital access, digital engagement. Coupled with this, I was doing the day job, as it were, of working within the film archive. Learning skills such as film handling, inspection, cleaning, things like that, as part of a technical team. IFA had made plans initially for the work I was to do, and it seemed pretty good, and the skills expected me to learn, but these quickly evolved as different opportunities arose. As this was the kind of first year of this scheme, a lot seemed to evolve organically, especially in regards to practical elements. So I did projects that weren't listed, including running the archive's Heritage Open Day, which was crazy, involved producing a film from archival footage, archive photography, audio tracks, clearing all the copyright for that, all the rights, marketing the event, securing a guest speaker. As well as this, I proposed to the archive to build an optical disc imaging workflow, which sounds pretty complex, but isn't really, using open source software called the Curator. We were also encouraged by the TNA where possible to collaborate with each other. So as trainees, the three of us, three plus myself, travelled to the Vivacity archive in Peterborough, where we drew up a sort of minimum viable digital preservation plan for them. This was an interesting challenge as they had zero budget and zero computers. But we did what we could, and it was quite good. In terms of support, yeah, something I was going to talk about later, but I'll talk about it now. The TNA did a good thing in that they supplied a mentor, really, that wasn't employed by either the TNA or the archive I was in, so could give like an independent review of you, and if you had any issues, you could explain them to them whenever you wanted, and they could escalate it for you. So you never really felt alone. Plus you had your line manager and contacts at the TNA. So it was quite good in terms of that, yeah. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I think often traineeships do seem to have a mentor attached aspect, kind of outside of a line management thing. And Sian, you're nodding as well. Did you have a mentor on yours?
Yeah, so they had Cornwall Museums Partnership hired a freelancer so they weren't, you know, technically Cornwall Museums Partnership staff member, and they weren't a staff member of any of the host museums. They were a freelancer whose job was to basically, you know, lead us through our peer network meetings and to make sure that they were a point of contact for us at any point during the traineeship. So yeah, I thought that was, again, really good.
It's definitely something to keep an eye out when you're reading about a traineeship. That think about the support that might be in place for you when you're on it. I think that is quite important. I want to pick up on a question from the chat, but I have lost it. Is it worth applying for traineeships or jobs now if we haven't finished our studies yet? So you were kind of both at different stages kind of in your lives at the point you did a traineeship, but did it matter kind of where you were when you applied?
So if you like, absolutely not. They were really just looking for enthusiasm and some kind of demonstration of the skills they were looking for. It didn't matter if you had qualifications or not. They really looking, I think that was the whole point. They were looking for people who could bring something different to the kind of traditional application process.
Thanks. And Sian, was it similar for you and yours?
Yeah, so I had done my degree a few years back in ancient history, so not really anything kind of vaguely related, but not really to my host museum. And I was actually doing a part-time master's degree for 4 years in Celtic studies. So again, a completely different subject, just for my own kind of interest. But yeah, I couldn't really afford to just do a normal degree or master's in like a year and move somewhere. So I couldn't really do that with museum studies. So I was doing like this part-time master's degree, alongside the whole thing. And I've only just finished that in September. So I don't know if I even put that in the application. I don't know if that would have helped me or hindered me, actually. But yeah, I didn't have any sort of museum studies qualification or anything.
And it's probably worth noting that a lot of traineeships are specifically aimed at people who do not have an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate degree. I'm thinking particularly of the British Museum's Museum Futures trainee scheme, which kind of runs annually and is specifically about routes into the sector for young people who don't have those qualifications, for example. It's not that there are a lot. I'm just picking on one that I happen to know the entry criteria for. I want to come on to another question. I'd like to know a bit about how your traineeship prepared you for the role that you moved into after your traineeship. And Sian, this may be a sort of speculative question a little bit as well, because it's so new for you. But I will start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I think it did set me up quite well. Obviously, I was already in the host museum, so I think the big part was just fitting in really well at the organisation itself, fitting in really well as a team member, and again, some of the things that I had to do specifically, I'm assuming because of this year, all of the digital stuff, all of the just natural kind of engagement work that I was doing alongside it. So yeah, I didn't really I was a trainee curator, but the curatorial work I didn't really get to do a huge amount of that because, you know, for a big chunk of the year, we weren't, you know, in the physical space of the museum. So yeah, I kind of think all of the engagement stuff that I kind of just did, just looking for things to do, because I kind of got panicky at one point, like, oh no, you know, I'm doing this traineeship and I really want to prove myself. I really want to do a good job. I kind of have to make myself as busy as possible. Yeah, I kind of think that did probably lead on and put me in good stead for this engagement role. I don't know if I would have gotten the engagement role without this traineeship. In fact, I'm going to say that I would not have got it without the traineeship. I think it was already being part of the team and being a natural kind of member of the team that really helped me in that regard, which is kind of what I hope traineeships will become. You know, they won't just be these kind of posts like internships have often been used to kind of get cheap labour for a few months and then often nothing at the end of it. Kind of hope that traineeships will kind of be geared more towards the idea of they're there because there's a big chance that they will lead on to something kind of concrete.
I think on that particular note of kind of what it might lead to in the same organization, I want to hark back. I hosted on Monday a conversation about managing trainees and apprenticeships, and one of the biggest regrets that the people who are managing trainees mentioned is that they can't offer jobs for every trainee kind of staying within their organization. They don't have that option. That's not how it's been set up. And I can definitely see Sian's point about what happens next is it's a sector-wide question. What happens after traineeships? What happens in the next step after entry-level jobs? And I don't think we're going to answer that in this session, but the best we can do is kind of equip you with all the information that we have. Michael, you moved out into another organization after completing your traineeship. So what was that like for you, and how did your traineeship kind of prepare you for that?
It was an unexpected bonus to get the position I applied for, to be honest. I was just at the beginning of my application process, and I was sort of speculatively applying to things that looked useful, but I think it must have helped. Certainly having the National Archives in your CV, as well as working in the Film Archive, would have been beneficial. But I think in terms of what I was doing, having the kind of solid grounding in theory is always useful in any kind of GLAM setting, I would imagine. That's where having the coursework side, I think, really gave me a head start, despite not having a qualification. Although introductory, it kind of covered many of the bases I used. And I used this to kind of develop my independent study, and I think that helps. Having, and also working for the BFI, I think having an awareness of moving image preservation specifically and terminologies was very useful. In terms of what I needed for the job, I was working with metadata frequently and cataloging, which are things that I probably use daily just now. Also, one thing that we did, I thought was quite ingenuitive, really, was as a cohort, we'd meet up quarterly. It wasn't always at Q, but it usually was. And the facilitator, who was independent, who did the meetups, introduced us to kind of theories of behavioral psychology. And we were encouraged to kind of think about the way we act, as well as what we do. So this kind of introspection, I think, is being useful going forward. And I think also kind of what I think is really important is kind of grabbing every opportunity you've got. So if you get the chance to attend any conferences, any events, go for it, push for it. You might have to apply for funding, but go for it. I went to one called No Time to Wait, which is an annual sort of open source, it's not that important, but technology conference. And everybody there were the people that I was looking up to, who I was reading about. And I got a chance to meet up with my manager now, Stephen McConaughey, who was presenting. And I imagine that kind of thing really helps as well, the kind of networking opportunities you get from that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Not just, I mean, it goes across the board for museum careers, really. You need to take the opportunities that you can, especially in terms of trying to meet people and get to know them. I'm going to actually throw over to Tom. So you did your traineeship, I think you said about 5 years ago. And I wonder if you maybe could reflect a little bit for us on what sort of, you've had a few jobs since your traineeship. How well did it prepare you for where you've got to at this point?
I think it prepared me reasonably well. The interesting thing about my traineeship was it was hosted by Worcester Cathedral Library and Archive. So it was definitely more prepared for that route. So there was practical instruction in things like paleography, for instance, that was much more applicable to a library or an archive career. And I tried to move in that direction because I really enjoyed my traineeship and I love books, like old books, such fascinating collections to work with. And I found I just got absolutely nowhere, largely because I didn't have an MA in archive studies or library studies. It was just a massive block. So I went back to museums, which is where I began my voluntary experience since graduating, as I found it was just a bit easier to make inroads in that area. But I still would say it wasn't an easy road. I applied for 3 jobs towards the end of my traineeship, and I was rejected by the first 2. And the third one that I did get, it was only a part-time position, and it was 3 days a week. And the other 2 days a week while I was doing that job, I volunteered again, just because I really wanted to launch my career, and I felt that, I don't know, I felt a bit down in the dumps maybe that I hadn't been able to secure a full-time job. So I felt there was still an element of further like upskilling that was involved after my traineeship.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it is, we have to be realistic about what it means. Doing a traineeship is not a kind of magic bullet to get you where you want to go. It's another way of gaining skills. I can see in the chat there's a lot of conversation, and I want to come to Sian, because you have said you want to reflect more on this kind of amount of qualification issue that is really very prevalent in the chat, and I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, I can totally understand people's frustration with that, because I remember for a while, you know, for years, I was told that I needed to volunteer for years. I needed to do unpaid work for years. I needed to have a degree. I needed to have a master's. I needed all these things. So I went and did all those things. And then when I started going for entry-level jobs, I was, you know, looking at internships, looking at traineeships that had totally, I was locked out of, which was so kind of frustrating for me, because at the time I was like, what, 24, 25, and I already felt past it. Like I was supposed to already be established in a museum role at that point. So it was kind of horrible. And I do think that we need to really change the way we look at kind of recruitment and stuff, and what we tell people that they need to do, because we have a whole generation now of people that have kind of done what they've been told to do, but now might end up being overqualified. But then we do also have to make sure that we are being fair to people that haven't had the kind of privilege to be able to get a master's, to be able to, you know, volunteer and things like that. And I think it's really frustrating. And I do think that some organizations, in their, you know, very good-hearted desire to be more inclusive, often end up being quite exclusionary to people who, like I said, are just doing what they've kind of been told that they need to do in order to work in the sector. So I think it has to be a bit more balanced. I don't know if completely locking out all, you know, people with a degree, it really works. And actually I was in a really good meeting the other day, and someone was saying that they had managed to convince the museum that they were working with at one point to interview people first. Obviously this cannot be done by all organizations by any means, but they interviewed everyone first, and then only afterwards did they ask for everyone's qualifications and everyone's experience. So it was really about getting to know the person, and if the person would be a good fit and would be able to handle the kind of work that was expected of them, which I thought was probably the most fair, because then it's not, obviously it can't be done, you know, all the time, or it isn't done at the moment, but then that's not being kind of too favourable to people with degrees or too favourable to people without degrees. Yeah, I definitely just wanted to say that I really empathise with people's frustration.
Thanks, Sian. Tom is waving at me. I'm going to get Tom back in on this topic, but then I am going to go back to talking about the traineeships again, so we can get some more questions.
Yeah, just to say quickly, my traineeship was, the flip side of it was graduate traineeship. So it was closed to people without degrees. And I think both have massive elements of unfairness to them. And we've heard a lot from trainee providers about the way that they recruit and are recruiting based on what pre-existing skills they want their trainees to have and to develop within those roles. And that doesn't necessarily have to include any qualifications at all. And I think that's a much fairer way to manage that sort of selection for traineeships. So nobody's shut out.
Thank you. I think that is really important. There are traineeship providers who want to kind of think about that. And I wonder, Michael, if I could throw over to you, just because you came at a traineeship kind of, I'm going to say, slightly further on in your life than some of the people in the chat. And I wonder, like, how was that for you? And was it all about your transferable skills?
It was challenging. My wife and I had basically established our careers, as it were, and she was a midwife and doing quite well, and I was doing okay in retail. We made the decision, let's go for it. So up and moved, and I went into retail, and I took a bit of a pay cut, but it was definitely worth it. In terms of transferable skills, definitely, I think that was the main thing. Dealing with people is the same, regardless of in what industry you work with, and I think people undervalue that, the ability to give points cogently, or just be a welcome voice in a room, I think was something that was really useful. But I think what was interesting in my traineeship was there were people from all walks of life. There was a guy that stepped down from managing directorship of a firm and decided he wanted to retrain, so he did it. And then there was people straight from school. And there was a couple like myself who maybe had a degree and maybe not followed it the way we wanted to. So yeah, I think it's definitely a role. If you're willing to kind of deal with the sacrifices that you have to give, really, it's definitely I think worth considering, I would say.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear that there were a wide range of people on that particular traineeship as well. I think it's difficult because we're talking about the experiences of 3 particular people on particular traineeships, but there are a lot of other traineeship options that get advertised. I know, for example, at the BFI, we're also currently hosting an Institute of Conservation funded trainee role in one of the other departments. There's a lot of other things available. So we are talking about the ones that we have experience of. We aren't answering every question about every traineeship because we just don't know all of that information, but it is out there, and we will post some resources when we post this video, so you can go out and find some of those things. I want to come on to another one of our questions. What wasn't covered in your traineeship that, looking back on it now, you really wish had been covered? And I'm going to come to you first, Michael.
I don't know about what wasn't covered because it was fairly expansive. But for me, what would have been really useful would have been to be provided with, I don't know if it's because I've done the education thing or what, but a decent reading list to expand independent learning, not just reading, but journal articles, websites, podcasts, blogs, Twitter accounts, mailing lists. All these things I think are invaluable when you're starting out in the big bad world. It's not as simple as just going to the library anymore. It's in the stratosphere, really. As well as reading lists, I think what would be useful would be upcoming conferences, events, things like that, and resources to a new trainee, not just for networking, but for experiencing. That's how you take things in by osmosis, really. And I think that kind of gives you the leg up as you pursue your journey into the sector, really. Traineeships are really time limited, and that's the big issue. You almost feel like you have to fit everything in. But if you were given that kind of, even, I think what we talked about doing in our traineeship was getting our things together for the next year, really, writing down a list of things that we could provide to the next year's cohorts to help them out. So that was kind of the thing I thought was missing, and a qualification would have been nice. But nah, that's fine.
I think that's something that is an issue kind of across any entry route into the sector, is like, where do you find information? Like, where do you find that list of events? Where do you find jobs? Where do you go to look for reading lists? Because you can Google it, but then you're getting an unfiltered selection of, I mean, who even knows what? How many pages in do you go? And I think that is definitely something that is kind of not unique to traineeships necessarily, but when you come into the sector, getting that information. Sian, I wonder what you would wish had been available, or wish that had been covered now that you're in a different role.
I mean, I echo Michael, really, because it would have been nice to have had those kind of resources. We did them all ourselves. Do you know what I mean? Me and the other trainees, we did, became quite close. We had our own little group chats. We had a kind of Milanote, I don't know if any of you use that, but we all put resources onto this website that we shared and we could all access. So, you know, we compiled all these kind of resources ourselves and created this really brilliant space, and we are passing that on to the next cohort. It would have been nice if that we'd had more provided to us rather than kind of, you know, doing the legwork and doing ourselves. But other than that, I think my answer might be a little bit unfair just because of this year, but it would have been nice to have done maybe a bit more curatorial work this year. I didn't get a chance to do so much of that. But I think because of that, I did loads of engagement stuff, which led me onto the role I'm doing now. So I can't be too angry.
Thanks. I think it's really positive. I mean, it's positive that you both say that you have kind of solved that gap for the people coming after you. So now it's up to them to kind of find the next thing that they have to solve for the next lot as well. So I think it's good that you have kind of worked to help for the next cohort, which is really important. I wonder what you would say if people are thinking about hosting a trainee in their organization. What would you like to tell them? What do you want them to know from a trainee perspective? Sian, I'll come back to you.
I think do it in good faith. Don't do it like I said before, don't do it simply because you want someone to do all the same job roles that someone could be paid for, you know, with a proper salary, but just cheap labor. Like, don't do it for that at all. If there's absolutely no chance that they could have any kind of role within the organization or within any kind of similar organization, then I think it's not really worth doing. I know you can't make promises that we're absolutely going to give you a job at the end of it, or you're absolutely going to walk straight into another job. You can't do that. But I feel like organizations have to do it in good faith. So it has to be a real mutual benefit. It can't just be, okay, what are you going to do for me? You know, what's this trainee going to do for this organization? It really has to be a mutual kind of relationship there. So they have to really keep in mind what they can do for the trainee, how they can train them, what resources they can give them. And as I said, for me, what really helped was being treated. I know I was a trainee and I did want some guidance, and I did get some guidance in some aspects. But what helped me was being treated with respect and being treated as just like an equal member of staff, because it made me feel very comfortable then and confident being able to say, oh, actually, I do need a little bit of help doing this, or oh, I'm not quite sure how to do that, because I already had those good relationships with my colleagues. So I would definitely say to organizations, make sure that you are keeping that mutual benefit in mind and just treat people with respect.
I think that's kind of a theme of this conference is just generally just don't be a dick. I think that is always true for any job, any traineeship, any organization, any individual human. I think that's something we can all just internalize in all our interactions, and that would solve, I suspect, quite a few of our problems. Michael, I'm going to come to you. What do you think that organizations and maybe managers might need to consider when hosting a traineeship?
I think Sian's stole most of my thunder, really. I think the hosts, probably sounds negative, they need to ask themselves, are we able to provide the grounding that the trainee needs? Are we willing to invest a great deal of time and resource, because it is a great deal of time and resource, into carrying out planning before and during the placement? The trainee is going to need a support network from regular members of staff, and they're also going to need training, equipment, desk spaces, and preferably access to industry events, conferences, travel. I spoke to one archivist at a conference who freely admitted that she wanted to take on a trainee as she saw it as a chance to employ a member of staff on a low wage. Don't get me wrong, there's umpteen benefits to be had to the hosts in this regard, but as a trainee is going to bring to you uncapped enthusiasm, freshness to an institution, I don't think that should be the primary motivation. It should be borne in mind that the trainee generally sacrifices a lot themselves in time and finance to take on a traineeship. So they should expect to be valued in their own right, really. But apart from that, do it, it's great.
I think that's, yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting reflection. I think if someone is outright saying we should get a trainee because it's it's going to be cheap to us. They're actually not understanding the support that needs to be provided, because that is not how it should be. If you're being supported as a trainee, you should have all of that access, as you said, Michael and Sian earlier, like access to conferences and all the events that all of the other staff would have access to. And I think, yeah, not understating that you need space to work, and actually you are a member of staff that needs all of the same things as any other member of staff would need. I am going to just throw over to Tom. I wonder if you could maybe give a little bit of Fair Museum Jobs perspective in what we would say a traineeship offer would want to provide.
I think traineeships are like, proper jobs, for want of a better word, but they should have a definite training element, and there should be set learning outcomes that delineate what the trainee should be able to do at the end of that traineeship. And that is the that's the payoff for the fact that they're often paid below an entry-level job. That's the sort of upskilling that you get in lieu of that. We would always say that they should be paid living wage, though, at a minimum, because that's just a basic human right in the Fair Museum Jobs view. So yeah, set learning outcomes and a set supervisor as well, somebody who actually has it written into their job description for the duration of the traineeship that they are there to provide support in all its widest sense as well. So not just delivering the training, but also that there's somebody there for HR support, which is often lacking in these things, and somebody for pastoral care as well. I think is important, especially because with these traineeships, a lot of the times people do travel to other parts of the country to undertake them. I know, Sian, you said that some people travel to Cornwall for yours, and on mine in Worcestershire, only 2 people were from within the county. The rest had travelled from places as wide as Norfolk, London, Surrey. So yeah, there does need to be real support in place.
And I think some of that is being reflected in the chat around, like, will you have the money to sustain yourself? And it is a legitimate thing to think through. And we in that sense, it is the same as when you're applying for a job. You need to take a critical eye to what that thing is offering you and whether it fits with your life. And I mean, Michael, you've talked about how you did that kind of in your family unit, thinking about, you moved across like a fair distance across the country and sort of uprooted existing careers. I mean, if you're happy to reflect a bit more on that, it would be great to hear it. But if not, that's also completely fine.
Definitely. Yeah, I think I'm kind of lucky that my wife and I kind of share the same opinion that we will do whatever we can to help each other out, really. If that meant 2 steps forward, 1 back, whatever it is. So I previously I'd moved to Aberdeen for Alana to help her graduate to get her midwifery, and the kind of payback. We moved to Norwich for me. It was a massive thing to do. Moving's not cheap. There's no way to make it cheap, but I think in hindsight I wouldn't change it. It was definitely the right thing to do. And sometimes you got to make sacrifices, I guess. It's just whether it's right for you or not. No one else can tell you that, really. You can have to weigh up the pros and cons, and it's some sticky situations and discussions sometimes to come to that conclusion. But it's such sometimes getting a place in these traineeships is such a privilege. Privilege isn't the right word. You've done so well to get it. It's a shame not to pursue that.
I think that's a really important point. Only you can know kind of what your circumstances are and whether a traineeship will work for you. Just the same as only you can know whether a master's level qualification is for you. I know there's talk in the chat about whether that is the right thing, but only you can know whether it is the best option for you. And you just have to kind of, it is frustrating, and none of us have an answer. We can't just say to anybody, this is what you should do and this is we can't wave a wand and show you the path to get where you want to go. God knows I wish I could do it for myself, let alone for everyone in the chat. And I think we all appreciate, all of us in this session, the issues that everyone is up against, for sure. And that's why Fair Museum Jobs exists in the first place, because we see these issues across the sector and we're trying to help people kind of make them better. And I think that comes directly onto my next question. I'm going to keep Tom with us and I'll come to you in a minute on this. What do you think that traineeships can do for kind of the wider heritage, glam sector in its kind of widest sense? I'm going to come to you first, Sian.
So yeah, as I said before, I would love if traineeships could eventually fade out some of the volunteering kind of roles in museums. I think it would have to be a slow kind of, you know, slow and steady wins the race type of situation. But I would love if paid internships or traineeships were kind of utilized a lot more, but not in that sense of, you know, we just need some cheap labor to do this job, but in a real kind of sense of, okay, we need to change the sector, we need to make sure that we're getting in the right types of people. I think that it would be a lot more accessible to people. I think it would be a lot more fair, and I would just love for traineeships to help change the landscape of the museum sector, really.
Thank you. I think I would also love to see that. Michael, what are your thoughts on kind of what traineeships do in the widest sense?
I think they benefit all stakeholders, really. I think traineeships on a larger scale help to kind of democratize accessibility to the sector. I feel like the heritage sector has a long way to go to try and break down barriers to entry and go beyond, like we were talking before about necessarily having a master's. It seems a bit anachronistic these days. This is not to devalue the degrees, but I think you could argue they exacerbate privilege and favour those that can afford it, etc. It was certainly a concern amongst my cohorts and I that would we be able to secure a position at the end of our traineeship when all job adverts we were seeing demanded this as an essential criteria. But I think there's been a bit of a sea change recently where more and more job adverts I look at value equivalent experience, whatever that means. And I think generally what we're talking about here kind of fits within that. I think traineeships are also a really essential vehicle for plugging identified gaps in skills or representation in the sector. In my case, the TNA acknowledged that transitioning from centuries of paper-based archiving to digital and born digital requires a whole new skill set. And to their credit, they've sought to bridge that gap, pardon the pun. Lastly, I think purely anecdotally, it's my experience, I think trainees also bring kind of an infectious enthusiasm, a freshness, a kind of a lack of cynicism, it's hard to believe, right? To a workplace when they're in their placements and moving on. You learn how, as I said earlier, during the traineeship, how to communicate with people and stakeholders at every level. And this can only be advantageous to whoever's taking you on, I think. So I don't think there's any negatives to be had by carrying on with them, to be honest.
Definitely. And Tom, can I ask you to reflect on the same?
Yeah, I think I've got very little to add to that, really. I completely agree with Sian that often people have been undertaking significant amounts of voluntary work to gain experience just to get onto the career ladder, and that's bad, really. That's really, really bad, and that's one of the main problems with our sector. So I think traineeships are a very good way around that. Yeah, I'm not sure I really have that much else to add.
No, that's fine. I think I definitely want to reflect back a bit about what Michael said. I think there is a really good use for traineeships is about those skills gaps in the sector and using traineeships to kind of train people on those gaps, but then also you're sending out a trained group of people into the workforce to help kind of upskill other people in other organizations about some of that work, especially if you go into a smaller organization after your traineeship. You might be the only person with some of that knowledge, and I think that's something really important not to be underestimated about any kind of new skills that come up. I think I would say that's definitely a factor personally. I would like to know from you all what most surprised you about doing your traineeship. Maybe something you got to take part in that you never would have expected, or something about how it worked that was quite a surprise? I'm going to come to Tom first because I can.
Yeah, so there was a whole plan for my traineeship. It was 15 months long, and it was all set out at the beginning. But about 3 months into it, the cathedral had found out that they'd been successful in applying for a grant to repair the library roof, and they hadn't told the librarian about this, who was my supervisor. So we quickly found out that we had to relocate the entire holdings. So that was about 5,500 early modern books, about 350 medieval manuscripts, and the same number of medieval incunabula, which are medieval printed books, essentially, and 20,000 archival documents. We had to move them out of the space where they had been since at least 1866, and the only access to the space as well was a spiral staircase with 46 steps. So that was obviously a major decant project, and it was really, really, really hard work, but it was really good experience as well. And yeah, that was definitely something that I really valued as a learning opportunity for my traineeship.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like being thrown in at the deepest possible end. But it also sounds a lot like a quick intro into the normal world of work, where somebody does something and the other hand doesn't know, and then you have to deal with the consequences. So I imagine that was quite good.
It just reflects the reality of the workplace. So yeah.
Michael, I wonder if I can come to you. What was kind of one of the biggest surprises for you?
It's not as good an anecdote really, but I think kind of corny, but I think how receptive people were to trainees. I was a little bit concerned that there might be a bit of sort of turning the nose up to trainees, but people were really interested. Everyone I met, can you write a blog? Can we interview you? We want to know what's happening. This is really exciting. My colleagues at the East Anglian Film Archive really took the time and really cared, and they're really proud to host the trainee, and they've since become some of my best friends. So yeah, I think just how well it was received. Really, it's not much of a surprise, but it was a pleasant surprise.
I think that's really nice, because you never know what you're going to get, especially on a kind of newer initiatives. You don't know what to expect. So I think it's really good that was the surprise. Sian, I wonder what you would say.
Yeah, so everyone was the same, yeah, people wanted to interview you, yeah, write a blog, learn all about it. So it was really nice. For me as well, we were quite lucky because they had given us a training budget, and they'd given us travel budgets to go to London and visit some of the national museums. And I think for me, what was really eye-opening was just learning just how different regional museums are to national museums. And I mean, obviously that's speaking from my kind of perspective. I might be totally wrong there. But just in terms of like, it gave me a bit of hope, because I'm from Cornwall originally, and the idea growing up is you have to leave Cornwall, or you have to leave rural areas and go straight to a big city to be successful, because otherwise you won't be successful. So knowing that, there might potentially be traineeships in, more regional museums across the board, I think it's really hopeful to me. And the fact that I got to be in a museum in my hometown in Cornwall is just absolutely really incredible. So the biggest surprise to me was just knowing just how flexible you can be in a regional museum, because it's a smaller team and you just need to do lots of different types of work, not more work, but different types of work. You're not kind of shoehorned in to any kind of one department. Even though it was a trainee curator role, I was basically doing so many different things. So yeah, I think it's been really hopeful for me actually, and I hope more smaller regional museums can create these types of programs and traineeships, and not only keep people from the local area in. I don't want to be parochial, because plenty of people moved down to Cornwall for the traineeship, but it really helps that local area, especially if it's a regional area. You've suddenly got an influx of different types of people and a different type of skill set. So I think it can only be a benefit.
I think that's a really lovely reflection, and I think as well, because the traineeship you did as well, Michael, was about putting people in organizations outside of the standard city areas. And I don't just mean London when I say that. It was about getting out into other areas. And I think that's very true of a lot of schemes. I'm going to say again, like the British Museum Museum Future scheme is about being placed in other museums. It's not about kind of that centralized practice, I suppose. And I think that's a really good thing that traineeships can do. I'm going to just ask one more question, and this is a question we're going to end on. If someone is thinking about signing up for a traineeship, what advice would you give them, and what should they make sure they put on their application, Sian?
In terms of what they should put on their application, I think for me, I know the word passion often gets overused, but for me, it really did help that I was really into Cornish history, and I had, you know, familial links to the China clay industry, which Wheal Martyn's the China Clay Museum. So I really had that kind of very specific interest in it, and I had that passion. Whereas, so I think have at least one thing like that that's really strong. So for me, I did have like experience volunteering in museums and stuff, but my big thing was that I was really, really excited about that specific bit of history, as well as museums in general. So I think I would tell potential trainees, just kind of, yeah, don't fall out of love with museums, don't fall out of love with, you know, the fact you want to get into the sector for a reason, not just because you did a history degree and you feel like, oh, museums might as well, you know. You have to really kind of love the idea of museums and kind of working in museums. Other than that, I would like to plug that Wheal Martyn's trainee curator scheme is still open for 2 days. So the next cohort, I think it's Wheal Martyn, Royal Cornwall Museum and Falmouth Art Gallery. And I did link it, but I'll link it again in the chat. So that's open until Sunday, 5 p.m, closing date.
Thank you, Sian, and thanks for the plug. I suspect you're going to get a lot of applicants from this session. And Michael, the last word to you. What would you tell someone who is thinking of doing a traineeship?
Well, yet again, Sian stole a lot of my thunder there, but I'll go down a different road then. Do your research, really. Find out about where you're applying. Don't just blanket apply places. Does it seem like the right fit to you? Does what they're advertising seem like what you genuinely want to do? I took a lot of time looking through a lot of similar placements to come to that conclusion, because it is a big undertaking to do this, I'm not gonna lie. But also, don't be afraid to sell extracurricular activities, things that you do out with educational things go a long way. I've done some volunteering at film festivals and stuff, and that came up in an interview, so it must have been useful. I think that's really about it, really.
I think that's both really good bits of advice for if you're thinking about applying for a traineeship. And it's the same as a job. You can choose the thing that is right for you, and that's okay. I think I'm going to end on that note. Thank you so much, Sian and Michael, and thank you, Tom, for coming in on quite a few of our questions. I really appreciate that as well. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We will save the chat, and all the resources will be available with the recording. Thank you all very much. Tom will end this session very shortly. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.